Well, hello, welcome back to episodes 2 of Let's Talk Miami. Hopefully, a show that makes it easy to discuss local and national political issues. And if you haven't heard the news yet, we are now launching a podcast. So, not only are we going to be on YouTube, but we're on Spotify podcasts, and pretty soon, hopefully, we'll be on Apple Podcasts. So stay tuned to our Instagram page for those announcements so you can follow and subscribe. I want to take a quick minute to thank everyone who has been commenting and subscribing and liking, and just hearing from you, everyone has been great. The feedback on our last show has been really one of the reasons why we started this page, and I'm really grateful for all of you. I want to give a shout out to Jose Antonio for letting me know that there is an error in episode 1. There is a part where I'm talking about socialism and why we got this popularity for socialism. It was during the Industrial Revolution where we had child labor, and I mistakenly said we had 16-hour work weeks. What I really meant to say is that we used to have 16-hour work days. So sorry about that. Completely missed that typo. And on YouTube, we'll have an updated video letting you updating that error. So today's episode is actually inspired by our first commentator on YouTube, Quindell Johnson. I hope I said your name right. But what he was saying is that he missed the part on the threat of socialism. And he did not miss it. If you felt the same way, you didn't miss it, don't feel bad. We really took an approach of talking more about populism, since that's something that's not heard about so much on our news or even in our local talks. What we mostly hear about is socialism. So for those of you that don't live here in Miami or don't really hear much about socialism, this episode is for you. And I hope you like it. It's going to be about how socialism is creeping into our government, especially our local government. So let us know what you guys think, and let's begin. Alright, so let's recap what socialism is so that way we can kick off this conversation on the threats of socialism. Socialism is a populist economic and political system based on public ownership, also known as the collective of the means of production and distribution of goods. In socialism, there is no private property. Basically, your only property is the clothes on your back. And if you're here in Miami, you've probably heard the horror stories of immigrants that have fled from socialist countries such as Cuba, where Fidel Castro took away their homes, their businesses, their lands, and now it became the property of the country of Cuba and the population. And I think that private property and it is essential to the identity of our country, and I believe that the way socialism is creeping in to our country is through the stripping of our private property rights. When you hear about America, you usually hear about the American dream, and that American dream usually has a house in it. And that is why I say private property rights is so essential to the identity of our country. But slowly, those rights are being stripped away. And I'm going to share with you today a story that is actually quite personal. It is the story of my family. 2 years ago, in 2018, we had a Royal Poinciana tree, which is a beautiful tree, not native to Florida, but nonetheless beautiful. And we had planted this tree back in 2004. But now it had reached its expiration date. It was dying. Inside it was rotting. The bottom of the trunk was filled with worms that were slowly eating away at its roots. And this tree was massive. It was about 20 feet tall. It had engulfed the power lines, and it was starting to become dangerous. We live here in Miami, which means that we face the threat of hurricanes, and we were afraid that during any of these hurricanes, just a gust of wind would bring down that tree. And the way it was located, it would either fall on top of our neighbor's roof or on top of the avenue where we live in, which is a highly transited avenue. And with it, it would have brought down the power lines as well. So a fire hazard, definitely. And we decided we needed to remove this tree. And we didn't know any better. We removed the tree. We called a licensed company and had it removed. Well, a day later, we find out that we needed a permit. And we find out in the most ridiculous way. We have firefighters in front of our house, we have police, we have code enforcement, and we have an assistant state attorney screaming at my dad because he had killed and butchered a 100-year-old tree. Well, fast forward a couple of months into the process, we needed to now pay a $1,000 fine for not getting a permit, which we paid for. We were truly embarrassed by the fact that we hadn't applied to this permit. And once we paid, we thought it was over. Well, guess what? It wasn't. We now needed to replace the tree, which we were totally in agreement with. We had already bought a tree to replace it. We actually had bought 2 trees for this one tree. And we find out that the way that we have to replace the tree has to follow strict guidelines by the city. No longer, as private property owners, did we have the discretion to decide how many trees or what size were we going to pick to replace this removed tree. Now, that was going to be stipulated by the city government. And what the city was demanding is that we plant 24 trees with a height of 12 feet. No matter how hard we tried, there was no way that we could plant that amount of trees. Not only because of the cost, but simply because of the physical space restriction. As my mom said, the house had to become the house of Tarzan, completely engulfed by trees. And we would have to remove trees that we already had in the property to actually make space for them. If we couldn't comply with the planting, the other option is that we contribute $24,000 to the Tree Trust Fund. And this fund is meant to be used to restore the canopy of those trees that were removed. $24,000 at the time for us was 120% of our annual household income. It was impossible for us to comply with either the planting or with the payment. And all of this was in addition to the $1,000 fine that we had already paid for not having a permit. Despite providing all of this evidence to the city still took the position that they were going to require the full compliance of the tree replacement options. We had the option to appeal, but the appeal came with a cost, a $350 cost. And it was against the HEP board, which historically always goes with the Department of Environment in the city. And usually you need a good lawyer. 2 things which we just couldn't afford anymore. And in desperation, we sought out the help of our city commissioners. And thank God that there are still city commissioners that have a view of protecting our rights and protecting private property rights. Because without them, we wouldn't have been able to solve the issue. We found out through them that we had the option to get all of the public records regarding our case. And when we found all of the public records, we found hundreds of pages of emails of correspondence between a private citizen, city employees, and the assistant state attorney. Both the assistant state attorney and this private citizen were lawyers and well off to do. And they were using their power and their ability to really sway the decision of our case. From the moment we had the issue that we got fined to the moment that we had to pay, and then continuing on to the replacement of the trees, there had been correspondence in which we were, as the property owner and the defendant, were never involved in. And these people had slandered our family. They labeled us as developers with deep pockets, which was not the case at all. And that we should not have the option to negotiate at all with the city. And these people had so much power that they were actually able to make the city not negotiate with us. We found many issues in this case. One being the fact that our city is legislating to enforce, and people are just unaware of these legislations. And why I draw this example to explain the threats of socialism is that in socialist countries, you're constantly legislating to enforce. You have these new regulations every single day that are constantly criminalizing regular people for regular or really things that shouldn't be criminalized. For example, in Cuba, you're criminalized for having more meat than what you were allocated. Or you're criminalized for having new furniture that they assume that you paid under the table. In Nazi Germany, you were criminalized for being Jewish or for hiding Jewish people. And here in the city of Miami, you're being criminalized for removing a dangerous tree from your own property. So now, not only are you legislating to enforce, but now you're also relying on neighbors tattletaling on each other. And please don't get me wrong. You should call the authorities if you feel or you believe that your neighbor is being abused by their partner, or if they're in danger. Yes, you should call the authorities. But cutting down a tree does not warrant you the right to tattletale someone, and much less create a whole persona of that person that is completely wrong. These private citizens rallied other community members of a separate neighborhood of where we live from to rally against us because they believed we were developers with deep pockets who had no regard for the law or our trees. And we were just trying to make a buck, which was not the case at all. We were a low-income, hardworking family. And my issue is that if you're going to accuse someone, make sure that what you're saying is true. Because there should be some kind of responsibility, some kind of liability if what you're saying is wrong. In our case, we had no right to defend ourselves. And when it came time to being able to appeal, we were going to have to pay. The people who accused us had no financial liability at all. we were just incurring more and more costs because of their speculation against us. So not only is our city legislating to enforce, relying on neighbors tattletaling on each other, but they are not protecting our individual rights. Rights that are protected by our Constitution. In our Constitution, our private property rights are clear. We have a right to enjoy, utilize, and develop our property, as well as carry the liability that comes with that ownership. In this case, we were being asked to take on the liability. So had the tree fallen on our neighbor, on our avenue, on somebody, we would have to take on the financial costs that came with that problem. But we were being demanded by the city now that we had to provide a benefit to the city. So we had to plant these trees because these trees are improving the quality of life. And I'm not disagreeing with that. But I do not have to, as a private property owner, I don't have to do that. Already as a private property owner, we pay taxes that go towards our public schools. We pay taxes that go towards utilities, towards public infrastructure. So we're already helping, we're already contributing to the benefit of the public good. It is too much to ask that we also have to make sure that our private properties are beneficial to our communities around us. It should be up to that property owner. In our case, we had no problem with it. We completely agree, but it shouldn't be mandated. In addition to our private property rights, we were denied the 8th Amendment, which bans excessive bails and fines. We proved that the penalty was impossible to pay or comply with, and despite that, the city took on the position that they were going to ask completely for this full compliance, and if not, we were going to have a lien in our house, which would eventually make us debtors to the city, forcing us to eventually have to sell the house to be able to pay off that debt. And one cannot help to think, and this is speculation, so this is where my opinion comes in, and you can take it or leave it, but the question is, what was the point of all of that? Was it to remove a family from their house? Because if you can't pay, and the only way to pay for it is to sell that house, then is there an ulterior motive? Are you removing private property from individuals? And here's the icing on the cake. The Tree Trust Fund, which we were being asked to pay $24,000 towards, between 2015 and 2018 generated over $3.8 million in fines from properties across the city. And within that same time period, less than 50% of that money was actually used. But the best part is that when we actually looked through the expense reports, much of that money wasn't even being used on trees. Much of it was being used to finance travel arrangements for city employees to conferences. We were paying for food, hotels, car service. And when we actually looked at the few trees that were actually bought, you could see that the amounts were quite dubious. A pot that you find, a tree that you find in Home Depot retailing between $30 to $50, the city was paying $750 for. And you would think that with the level and the size of the city, they would be able to negotiate better prices than what you and I can negotiate at Home Depot. But they were paying way, way more. But my favorite expense was The expense for 8 crayons, a box of 8 crayons cost $166, and that was paid through the Tree Trust Fund. So in the name of protecting our canopy and our trees, our environment, improving the quality of our air, we're imposing burdensome fines and penalties on private property owners that what you're actually doing is you're telling them, you know what, don't plant any trees because you don't want to have these problems, basically. So you're dissuading people away from what you actually want them to do. And then you're increasing costs to people that are living here because those costs that are being incurred by developers are being passed down to the customer. Our freedoms, our rights are totally being ignored. And the whole purpose of it isn't even being accomplished because we don't have a bigger tree canopy. We just don't. We don't have a better air quality. In Argentina, we have a saying to describe the bureaucracy that's pervasive in that country. It says, un tramitecito más y plantamos el arbolito. For my non-Spanish speakers, that means one more procedure and we'll be able to plant the tree. Never in our wildest dreams did we actually imagine living out that phrase literally to the T. After 9 months of having bought our trees, we were finally able to plant them after finally getting a resolution with the city. We spent 9 months of intimidation because we had people that had been rallied by this private citizen through Nextdoor come to our property and look and see where had this tree been removed, to the point where we eventually had to cover our gate just to dissuade people from looking in or even coming at all. And these kind of intimidations that you usually only see in socialist countries like Cuba are being incentivized by these kind of regulations. And furthermore, not only are we being intimidated, but we're incentivizing corruption, as I've noted with what is actually going on with this tree trust fund. I think that there needs to be a better way of actually protecting our resources, protecting our consumers from wealthy corporations and financial interests in a way that doesn't hurt the small business owner or the small homeowner, which is what's happening right now with these kind of socialist regulations. So here's my challenge to you. When you hear of socialist ideas, such as free healthcare for all, free college education, why don't we demand, really, from our governments to use the resources they already have? As a people, we are already taxed significantly. We are being fined significantly. Why don't we use those resources to accomplish some of these goals, instead of creating regulations that incentivize more corruption? Let me know what you think, and if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Well, we hope you enjoyed today's show. We'll see you next time.